Welcome, everyone, to this History and Doors, talk, which we're doing via StreamYard, which again we all getting used to and learning. Good to see so many of you with us, joining us to learn about Margaret of Wessex. Please do hit that like button and subscribe, because the more we have, the more merrier it is for us, and the more we can enjoy it. And please do share everything you know about History Indoors to those around, and spread the word about us, because we do love to share our love of history and our love of history with the public and with the world. So please do share if you can. Our talk today is about Margaret of Wessex of Scotland, and it's given by our historian Stephen Bishop. Now, Stephen has been with History Indoors really ever since we started two and a bit years ago, which is kind of crazy to talk about there, Stephen. 2.5 years ago. Crazy how time flies. And Stephen's been researching the American Civil War, is, if I'm correct, and how it's remembered and in statues in America today, and the continuation from the legacy from the 19th and 20th centuries. But today it's like something very different with Margaret of Wessex and Scotland. So that being said, I will disappear, because you're not here to listen to me waffle on about History Indoors. You're here to listen to Stephen. So I'll disappear. Please do ask questions at the end, and we'll do our best to answer them and interact with you. But for now, I'll leave you in Stephen's most very capable hands.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction, and thank you very much to all of you for watching tonight. As I begin this talk, please do put in that comments box, that chat box, just where you're watching from tonight, and Michael can see that. It's just really nice to know from different places around the United Kingdom and probably around the world that you're watching this tonight. So thank you. Michael neglected to mention as well that we've had a very exciting development in History Indoors. So we've reached 1,000 subscribers now on YouTube, which is fantastic. So it feels really nice to be celebrating that with my talk. And it's also really apt to be talking about Margaret of Wessex today, or Saint Margaret of Scotland, because it is her feast day in the Christian church as well. And I may have done that on purpose, asking to talk about Saint Margaret of Scotland on this day. So why am I giving this talk in the first place? Well, like Michael said, I'm actually a PhD student at the University of Essex. I'm actually paused my studies at the moment because I'm working full-time in education. But I study the American Civil War and how that's been remembered in monuments and statues in America. However, my side historical passion has become the early medieval period, that pre-conquest period of English history. And I've given 2 talks about early medieval women. And at the beginning, when I gave that Lady Godiva talk, I didn't sort of necessarily plan for it to be a series, but I've been coming across quite remarkable women in the early medieval period. And I've wanted to share what I found, but for different reasons. So with the Lady Godiva talk, it was really a talk to show how she has been remembered as the unclothed woman on a horse. Actually, the sources about her life make us realize that she is important for other things rather than that myth that came about slightly later on, that even without that myth, she was a very important figure in English history in that pre-conquest period. And then when I chatted about Emma of Normandy, it was really to argue that she should be remembered more. Not that she'd been remembered incorrectly or could be remembered differently like Lady Godiva, but that she should be remembered more because she was twice Queen of England and twice Queen Mother. And I felt that she hasn't been done justice in modern history today, although that might be changing, as I mentioned in that talk. Now, if you want to catch up on those talks, please scan that QR code on the right-hand side there with your camera on your phone or device. But I'll also put the links to those talks in the description box as well after this talk. But why am I talking about Margaret of Wessex, St. Margaret of Scotland? It's because she has been remembered fairly well, in my opinion, not least because she is a saint, her epithet St. Margaret of Scotland. And I'm here to talk to you about why she has been remembered in that way. But it's not just a talk about Margaret of Wessex. It's a talk about her brother, Edgar Ætheling. It's a talk about Macbeth, Shakespeare's Macbeth, but the real Macbeth and the real Malcolm Canmore. And it's a talk also about what happens in the centuries after because of Margaret, the lineage of English and Scottish kings that eventually blends into the lineage of British monarchs ever since to this day. So I really hope that you'll find this talk interesting. And I'm going to divide it up into 3 parts. And part 1 will be about Margaret's exile. Now, I am going to have to go into a bit of history, a little bit of a backstory, and I've covered some of this in my previous talk. So I'll try and be as brief as I possibly can. But I think it's really important to get to understand the backdrop of English history and Scottish history leading up to the midway through the 11th century and beyond. So this is a map here of England in the late 800s. And England up until that time had been divided up into separate kingdoms. You may have heard of Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria, but also at other times there were smaller kingdoms like Kent and Sussex. And we get to a point where Scandinavians start to invade what we commonly refer to as the Vikings. And they invade, and they're remarkably successful at overtaking large parts of England. And you can see on this map from the late 800s, the Danelaw, those parts of modern day England that the Scandinavian invaders and then settlers controlled. And it's, roughly around half of that of what we would call England today. And it comes to its head in the late 870s, where Alfred, who is King of Wessex, he is surprised on Christmas Day, I believe, by Guthrum, who is one of these Scandinavian invaders. And they chase Alfred into the marshes of Athelney in the Somerset levels. But as many of you may know from English history, Alfred somehow manages to rally the local troops of the area, and he achieves an incredible victory over Guthrum against all of the odds in 878 at the Battle of Edington. And he does something really savvy and quite surprising. Rather than executing Guthrum and teaching all the Vikings a lesson, he makes him king of East Anglia, and he baptizes him as a Christian and renames him Athelstan. So he becomes King Athelstan of East Anglia. And the reason for this is to try and give Guthrum some ownership over that area of East Anglia and to prevent further raids. If Guthrum is in charge of his own parcel of land in England, then there's a hope that he will discourage further Scandinavian settlers. Now, Alfred's descendants, his son Edward the Elder, and then Edward's son Athelstan. Athelstan is the one to unite all of England into roughly what we would think of England today. And there are still small Viking incursions, but that is a high point for English history in terms of it being a cohesive country under Athelstan. Now, as we go through the 900s, as we get to the later 900s, the Scandinavian settlers come back. We have episodes like the Battle of Malden. And Scotland also has a similar-ish history in many ways to England, in the sense that they were a collection of small kingdoms or tribal areas. And you can see on this map, one of those is Strathclyde, Kings of Alba, for example. Dalriata, I probably butchered that pronunciation. I can't speak Gaelic, so I do apologise for that, and somebody might be able to correct me if they can spell phonetically in the comments box. But there is a similar-ish history of Scotland not being a cohesive country either, and there's also a shared history in terms of Scandinavian settlement in invasion and settlement in what we would now consider Scotland. So there are Norse rulers of Orkney, and at some point in the Hebrides, and even going over to Ireland, there are Norse descended rulers over in Dublin. But we get to the turn of the century, the millennium, And there is a king on the throne of England called King Ætheling the Unready. Now, his name means nobly counselled in our Old English. And the unready part is not that he wasn't ready to be king, but more so that he was poorly counselled. That word read or rad in Old English, and it's a Germanic word meaning counselled. So that his epithet really means King Ætheling the poorly counselled. And he is one of those kings where he is under threat from Scandinavian invasions frequently. And he takes different postures. Sometimes he fights, and sometimes he pays them off in massive sums to pay them to go away. Now, this isn't something, whilst that may sound weak, it's something that many rulers of England had done before, including Alfred, and even rulers on the continent of Western Europe as well. And some of the most well-revered rulers also employed that strategy at times. But Æthelred was not popular. Æthelred was not popular for doing this, and he wasn't an overly popular ruler. Now, Æthelred has many children from different women. One of his first wife, Elvira of York, bears him a son, Edmund Ironside, but also he has other children as well. But at the beginning of the 1000s, he casts aside, as so often rulers do, and he marries a woman called Emma of Normandy, the subject of my last talk for History Indoors. And she bears him 3 children. Edward, who has now been known as Edward the Confessor. You may notice his name from Year 7 history if you're watching from England. Traditionally, where Key Stage 3 history begins in our English curriculum. So Edward the Confessor is a fairly household name. She also has 2 other children, Godiva, not the same Godiva as Lady Godiva, and Alfred as well, not to be confused with Alfred the Great, just one of her children called Alfred. Now, in 1013, the Danes invade again, and they are successful this time. And for the first time, we have in England a Scandinavian king on the throne of all England. So not just parts of England, but all England. And Æthelred and his wife Emma are forced to go into exile with their children over to Normandy and over to Western Europe, where Emma has family. And King Sven is crowned in Gainsborough in Lincolnshire, and he is the first Danish king of England. But it doesn't last long. He dies, and there is a sort of a power vacuum. Æthelred is welcome back. Now, Æthelred dies as well during this period, and his son, Edmund Ironside, picks up the mantle as supposed king of England. However, there is another claimant to the throne now. There is King Sven's son, Canute, who believes that he has a right to the English throne through his father, Sven, who has just passed away. What happens culminates in the Battle of Assendon, where Canute defeats Edmund Ironside. And they have this uneasy truce, I guess, where Canute decides that Edmund will rule over Wessex, and Canute will reign over Mercia and Northumberland. Now, Mercia makes sense as well, because that's where his father had been crowned in Lincolnshire, typically the Mercian area or the area of the 5 boroughs. As so often in this early medieval period of history, this early 1000s, people mysteriously die at very opportune times, and Edmund Ironside dies very shortly after this, and that proclaims Canute as king of all England. Now, in that Emma of Normandy talk, I focus a lot on Canute and his reign and the importance of his wife Emma and his wife and queen Emma in England during this time. However, it's important to say that Canute has to deal with the other claimants to the throne. Now, Æthelred has children from Emma, but also he has children from his other wife, the descendants of Edmund Ironside. So he has grandchildren. He sends Edward the Exile, now known as the Exile, but Edward, who's Æthelred's grandson, he exiles him over to Europe. Now, there's many different stories about what happens to Edward, but it's probably likely that Canute had sent him over to Europe to maybe have him quietly disposed of by another ruler, perhaps the ruler of Sweden. But in any case, whatever story is true, that doesn't happen. And Edward the Exile, grandson of Ethelred, son of Edmund Ironside, he ends up in Hungary. Emma's children by Ethelred, Edward the Confessor, Godiva, and Alfred, they're sent to Normandy, and that's where they grow up. And that's probably the best offer Emma is going to get. She is the widowed queen of Ethelred. King Canute marries her, which is quite shocking. Does she have much choice in the matter? But in any case, from her own records, she has a happy marriage, or at least a successful marriage with Canute. But he can't have these children of Emma's from her first marriage around in England. So it's probably the best Emma's going to get is for her children to survive, but to be brought up in Normandy by her relatives. And this will cause problems later down the line with Edward the Confessor and also William the Conqueror. So when Canute dies in 1035, there are many claimants to the throne. There's his children from his first wife, Elfhiva of Northampton, who he had cast aside. Sven, but also Harold Harefoot. There are Emma and Ethelred's children, like I've just mentioned. And there are also Canute and Emma's children, Arthur Canute, who could also be a claimant to the throne. But as you can see, maybe on the right-hand side there, we also cannot forget Edward the Exile and his brother Edmund Ætheling, who have been exiled over to Hungary. Now, at this time, geography wins out. Who becomes King of England next is largely due to geography, and many of the claimants to the throne, including Edward the Exile, grandson of King Ethelred, they are nowhere near England at this time. Edward the Exile is in Hungary, and therefore Canute's son with Elfhiva of Northampton, Harold Harefoot, he takes a throne in England because he is the closest he is there. Now, Arthur Canute eventually becomes king because Harold Harefoot dies early. Arthur Canute dies early, perhaps because of a genetic disease running through Canute's line. But in any case, Edward the Confessor, Emma's child with Ethelred, becomes king in 1042. And that means the line of Wessex is restored. But what has happened to that line of Wessex with Edward the Exile? Well, Edward has children in Hungary with a woman called Agatha. He has a daughter called Christina. He has a daughter called Margaret, the subject of this talk. And we've said I had a long ways about getting here, but I think that backstory is necessary. And he also has a child, Edgar Ætheling. Now, it's really important, Edgar Ætheling, because the family are welcomed back to England in 1057 to Edward the Confessor's court. And Edward and his wife Edith, doesn't seem like they've had the particularly happy marriage that Edward probably would have hoped for. And most importantly, for the matter of kingship, he doesn't have a child with Edith, and he doesn't have a natural successor to the throne. Now, that natural successor would be Edward the Exile, perhaps Edward's cousin, a couple of times removed. But Edward unfortunately dies very soon after they reach England in 1057. And that just leaves Agatha and her 3 children at Edward's court. So we get to 1066. Edward the Confessor dies childless, and there is a power vacuum. There are claimants to the throne, and you may have remember this from your history classes at school. There are 4 claimants to the throne. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, one of the most powerful people in England, but not from the line of Wessex, not from a royal line in England at all, but has become one of the most powerful men in England. Then we've got Edgar Ætheling, Margaret's brother, Edward the Exile's son, and great-grandson of King Ethelred the Unready. But Edgar's only 14 years old around this time. Duke William of Normandy, who you will all know very well, cousin to Edward the Confessor, and King Harald Hardrada of Norway, who was inheriting his nephew's supposed claim to the English throne. Well, many of you will cast your minds back and realise at the beginning of 1066, Harold Godwinson becomes King Harold II of England. But this isn't to last for long, and William of Normandy becomes King of England at the Battle of Hastings in October of that year. And that brings us on to the second part of our talk. Margaret as Queen of Scotland. Now, we haven't focused on Margaret that much, but by this time in 1066, she is a teenager or a young woman by this time. Now, we haven't really cast our eyes to what's happening in Scotland, and this is where we get to Shakespeare's Macbeth, which you'll all know very well. Now, Shakespeare's Macbeth is based on a history book or chronicle called the Holinshed's Chronicles, and it's really been disparaged and discredited by historians as maybe a poor piece of history with many inaccuracies. And there are lots of inaccuracies in it, but I don't think that you can completely discredit the play as a work of history or the gateway to history just because of that. And I feel like that's what sort of happened to Shakespeare's Macbeth over the years. But who was the real Macbeth? Well, Macbeth was a ruler in Moray, and he perhaps usurps or kills another leader of Moray in perhaps a similar way that he does King Duncan in the play of Macbeth. But however, when Macbeth becomes king of Alba, or king of Scotland, when he kills Duncan probably fairly and squarely on the battlefield, so very different than the sort of very sly killing Duncan in his sleep. But in any case, Macbeth becomes king. King Duncan is defeated, and King Duncan's son is a man called Malcolm. And Malcolm flees to the English court of Edward the Confessor, and also spends a lot of time with Earl Siward of Northumbria, another figure in the history of the play of Macbeth. Now, Earl Siward of Northumbria launches invasions into Scotland, which is covered in Shakespeare's play. And eventually, in 1057, at the Battle of Lumphanan, Macbeth is defeated and Malcolm becomes king of Scotland. Now, this is a watershed moment for Scotland. As before this, as I said, Scotland had largely been tribal, few kingdoms, and this doesn't end it completely. And within those tribes and kingdoms, there was lots of fraternal infighting. It was quite a tradition in Scotland where the brothers would take over when their brother dies rather than the firstborn son. A little bit similar in how it happened with Alfred, King Alfred the Great. He was the last in a long line of brothers to be kings, but this was more common practice in Scotland, and you have a lot of this usurping of kings, as we saw with Macbeth and King Duncan earlier on. However, when Malcolm becomes king of Scotland, this will usher in a 40-year reign for Malcolm, enlarging the territory of Scotland and consolidating his rule, when his children would lead a long line of Scottish kings, the Canmore kings. So this was a watershed moment, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why Shakespeare chooses to focus his play on this particular period of Scottish history. There are other reasons which we'll go on to later, but perhaps this turning point in Scottish history is perhaps why Shakespeare, with a little bit of sprinkling of mixing around of the historical record and added a bit of historical fiction, but why he's chosen to look at this period of Scottish history, because it's a real watershed. And this is 1057, where Malcolm becomes king. Now, whether there's any overlap between him and Margaret and Christina and Edgar arriving to England in the same year, and him having been previously exiled to England at that time, I don't know. But that date is really important. Now, back to Margaret. In 1066, William has become king of England, but it's not a foregone conclusion that he's going to be successful. The English eyes the leading English people, instead of looking to this Norman usurper, this Norman invader, they look to the last remaining male hope of the line of Wessex, Edgar Ætheling, Margaret's brother. However, at the time of 1066, William goes on a rampage around the south at the end of the year and is crowned on Christmas Day as King of England in 1066. And naturally, this means that Edgar and Margaret and Christina have to flee the English court. Now, their options are fairly limited. I suppose they could have gone to Hungary, where they had grown up as children and where they were born. However, I don't know how possible that would have been. And I'm sure William probably wouldn't have minded too much just to get them out of the picture. And there are some reasons why I say that you may be able to maybe covered later on in the talk. However, they flee to Scotland and they flee to the court of King Malcolm III, the Malcolm we've just been talking about. Now, the records are interesting, and this picture here is Malcolm taking Margaret's hand in marriage. And the records talk about this, and I won't read out everything that's on that screen there. I will leave that up for you just to cast your eyes over. And there is another slide as well that I will move on to. But the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is a huge chronicle of English history, all the way up, way past this time period, and it's added to by various different monks and people throughout history. And because it is written largely by the literate monks, is the real always an emphasis on religious history. So a lot of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, if there's been peace in the country, there's not really an entry. So during Canute's reign, there was large times of peace, for example. His 20-year reign almost is condensed into a really small couple of pages. Whereas 1066, obviously a time of great turmoil in England, there's a lot of time devoted to it. Other times there's just records about the state of Christianity in England, when a bishop dies, when a bishop takes a position. But it's interesting how the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle covers this period where Edgar Ætheling, the last remaining English hope to the throne, flees to Scotland, and Malcolm receives Margaret, Christina, and Edgar to his court. And not just that, but Malcolm yearns after Margaret to be his wife. And the Chronicle covers how Margaret, being a pious, noble Christian woman who wanted to devote herself to the church, did not want to marry him. However, and I'll move on to the slide, she eventually gives in and marries Malcolm. Now, the chronicler puts a religious spin on this, and as you can see here, sort of puts the reason to Margaret giving in is because she, for that Bible verse in the New Testament where the unbelieving husband could be sanctified and healed through the believing wife. So in that way, the chronicler says, well, Margaret marries Malcolm because there's a hope that he becomes a Christian or more of a Christian because of the piety of Margaret. And there is truth in that. They do record how Malcolm sets his mind more so to matter to the church after marrying Margaret. So she definitely has her impact on him, and we'll see that in some other sources. However, thinking about things politically and pragmatically, Margaret probably doesn't have much of a choice. There aren't many other places that Margaret and Edgar and Christina can flee to at this time, with William king and obviously wanting to cast aside and to crush any rebellions that happen, and also the figurehead that the English resistance can cohesify around, which would be Edgar Ætheling. And I can also imagine that Edgar also does urge this marriage to happen between Margaret and Malcolm, because this gives Edgar a power base as well. If he does want to mount an assault, which he does rebel against William, and resistance does centre around Edgar, as we'll see. Having the backing of Malcolm, King of Scotland, his brother-in-law, I imagine would be very seductive for the teenage Edgar as well. Now, William of Malmesbury is another chronicler who writes about Margaret after her life in the between the 1100s and the 1150s and around 1127, and he does another chronicle of kings of England up until the reign of King Stephen in the 1100s. However, William is writing from a different perspective. Very often the chroniclers are unashamedly English, and they have that pre-conquest English perspective that the conquest was an overwhelmingly negative thing. England's been invaded by a Norman king, and they lament the state of England. Actually, one of the chroniclers laments this time period where things just get worse and worse and worse in England. And it's quite beautifully and poetically written, but it's a lament. William of Malmesbury is different. He's Anglo-Norman. He's got English heritage through one of his parents, but he's also got one parent who's a Norman as well. And therefore, he has a slightly different perspective. Now, they don't cast total praise on William the Conqueror. They're writing after he dies, so they do have a little bit of liberty to criticize him. For example, his harrying of the North, where he ravages the North for rebelling against him. However, they do cast William in a more positive light. However, William talks about Margaret, the brother of Edgar Ætheling, and he's not. These chroniclers aren't overly kind about Edgar, but they are kind about Margaret. And what they say about Margaret is that she is a woman distinguished for almsgiving and for chastity. So this story about her trying to prevent the marriage happening between her and Malcolm for religious reasons, for pious reasons, this is something echoed by other chroniclers as well, as if it was a well-known fact about Margaret that she's very pious. What he says about Edgar, well, as we'll see with Edgar, he does, with Malcolm, mount an assault into England shortly after he arrives at Malcolm's court, and they get as far down as York, but the rebellions are crushed. This happens often in Edgar's life, and William of Malmesbury talks very disparagingly about Edgar, that he had this futile love for his country, that he kept on coming back to England when he really shouldn't have done. But we'll focus on Edgar a little bit later. Another chronicler of this period, Henry of Huntingdon, again writing after Margaret dies. He is quite factual about the period, quite concise. However, he chronicles Margaret's pious behaviour shortly before her death. So the chroniclers write about Margaret very favourably as this Christian woman who's renowned for her piety, her chastity, and her charity to people in Scotland. And then we have perhaps one of the most important ones, I guess, Turgot of Durham. Now, he writes a life of Margaret shortly after she dies, and this is commissioned by her daughter, known as Edith or Matilda. Now, we'll move on to Edith and Matilda slightly later because she marries a very important person. But she hires Turgot to write this life of Margaret. And what's different about Turgot is that he met Margaret, he knew Margaret. So he's able to talk about Margaret from a personal perspective. It's very hagiographical in tone, and that means that he's writing with a distinct idea and hope to portray Margaret as a saint. And I mean, if you ever read it, it reads as if she was second to Jesus Christ in her piety and love for God. The woman could do no wrong in his eyes. Now, at first, it's quite striking when you read it because you're thinking you're overwhelmingly biased, Turgot. But then, if you think about some of the writings and the coverage after Queen Elizabeth II's death earlier this year, actually, a lot of that coverage has been about all the wonderful things Elizabeth has done. So hagiography, or sort of this very uncritical writing about much loved figures, it hasn't completely gone from our society today. But in any case, if you read this work of St. Margaret, he portrays her as incredibly pious. And in his life of Margaret, and he covers some of the religious changes that she brought to Scotland, which I'll cover in the next slide. But he also recounts a miracle that she did, and he emphasizes that even without this miracle, she should still be classed as a saint by the church. However, he does add this miracle, and the miracle centers around a beautifully engraved, beautifully designed version of the Gospels, and that it's dropped in some water in the river, but when the Gospel is plucked out of the water, that it is dry. It has not succumbed to the water around it, and that miracle is attributed to Margaret. So this is the miracle that perhaps helps her be canonized later on. Now, like I said, Margaret had a big influence on Scotland, and she brings religious changes to Scotland. She brings Scotland in line with her views and wider views of the church on matters like the sacrament at Easter, fasting at Lent, the Sabbath, for example, and how to observe the Sabbath, and also about outlawing a custom in Scotland about a brother marrying a brother's widow. And these reforms are carried on by her children. So, for example, she starts endowing Dunfermline, that we will see shortly, but this is carried on by her children when they reign in Scotland. So she instigates religious reform and gives lots of money to religious institutions in Scotland. Now, another way we can see her influence in Scotland is how her being English, I suppose she was born in Hungary, but to English parents, and then her formative years of her life, those teenage years, were spent in England at the court of Edward. And she has a lot of English influence in Scotland. And this is combined with Malcolm's English influence as well. He is Scottish, but he spent a formative period of his life in exile in England when Macbeth was king after he'd killed Malcolm's father, Duncan. And therefore, both Margaret and Malcolm in their marriage and in their kingship and queenship bring English influences and customs to Scotland. They also enlarge trade, for example, and we can see this English influence in the names of their children, which goes the names of their children going through the lineage of Margaret. Edward, named after her father. Edmund, named after her grandfather, Edmund Ironside. Ethelred, named after her great-grandfather. And Edgar, also an ancestor of Ethelred. Then we have a couple of anomalies, Alexander, Mary, and David. But then we have Edith there, their daughter, an Old English name, but she's also been referred to as Matilda throughout history, and this Matilda will become very, very important. So we can see by the naming of their children that Margaret had by no means cast off her Englishness at all, that she very much saw herself as an English woman and tied herself through to that noble line of Wessex. Now, before we go on to Edgar, we haven't really mentioned much about Margaret's sister, Christina. Now, Christina's a really interesting character. She almost lives the life that Margaret probably would have done if she hadn't married Malcolm. Christina lives out her days, and this is a picture of Romsey Abbey, I believe, down in Hampshire. And she is down there as an abbess and devotes her life to God. And we have this very interesting story where Margaret's daughter, Edith, also known as Matilda, writes about how Christina had tried to force Matilda, to stay in the nunnery against her wishes and did not want her to get married to any man. And Edith basically kicks off about this massively. So a very interesting story. But Christina, by all accounts, sounds like a very strong woman and devoted her life to God and was not interested in marrying anybody, whether that be a Norman coming over or an Englishman or anybody from Scotland. So Christina sort of lives the life that perhaps Margaret was envisaging for herself before she married Malcolm, King Malcolm of Scotland. Now, Edgar Ætheling. As I mentioned before, he leads, once Malcolm has married his sister Margaret, he and his brother-in-law mount this offensive in the north of England. It's unsuccessful. William vanquishes it. And there are other times where resistance against William cohesivises around Edgar and centres around Edgar. But Edgar is this political hot potato. He never gains enough support from enough people in England to mount that decisive comeback against William and to become king and to restore the line of Wessex to the throne himself. Instead, Edgar is exiled on occasions by William, and Edgar lives a long life. He outlives his sister Margaret, I believe, and he even participates in some of the Crusades in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. And Edgar reminds me, if we think about that quote from William of Malmesbury, where he denounces Edgar as basically this man who is futile, has this futile love for his country, even though that he should probably stay away, that he's never going to become king or amount to anything in England. But he has this futile love for his country, where even though he's been to different courts around Europe, he keeps on coming back to England and that hope of returning. He reminds me a bit of Bonnie Prince Charlie, another figure from Scottish history, English and Scottish history, a political hot potato. Can really never call one place his home. Edgar can't really call England his home because of that threat by William. Can't really call Scotland his home because he's not a native Scotsman. I suppose he could have settled properly in Scotland, but he has this hope that that he is the deserved king of England, and he never settles on the continent as well. And for different rulers around the British Isles and in Europe, he's a liability to have at your court. If you have him at your court, you're only going to draw the ire of the powerful King of England, William, and then William's successors as well. So Edgar becomes a bit of a Bonnie Prince Charlie, in my opinion, somebody that is a bit of a liability for other rulers to have around them. And then back to Malcolm. Well, Malcolm dies at the Battle of Alnwick in 1093. After a reign of about 40 years. Now, after William the Conqueror dies, his son William Rufus ascends to the throne, and William reneges on, goes back on an agreement with Malcolm, and Malcolm is furious and leads a raid into Northumbria, and he's killed by Robert de Mowbray, a Norman Earl of Northumbria, his forces. And not only is Malcolm killed, but him and Margaret's eldest son, Edward, is fatally wounded during the battle as well. So in this one battle, both Margaret's husband and their eldest son die. And Margaret dies 4 days later. The Annals of Innisfallen tell us that Malcolm was slain in an unguarded moment in battle by the French, meaning the Norman Robert de Mowbray. And Margaret, his wife, died of grief for him. And Turgot also explains how, and Henry of Huntingdon explain her piety in those moments before his death. I think it's Turgot who says that Margaret didn't even need to be told that Malcolm and her son had died. She could just sense it, and she dies 4 days later. And Margaret's resting place was Dunfermline Abbey. She died in Edinburgh, but was laid to rest in Dunfermline Abbey, the place where she had endowed much to. Now, what happens to her body is quite unfortunate. Mary, Queen of Scots, exhumes her body and tries to take parts of her body to Edinburgh. These are then, for some reason, relocated to France, and they're lost during the French Revolution. So unfortunately, there are parts, I believe, unless anybody knows anything different, there are parts of Margaret's body missing to history, which is a real shame. But this was her original resting place at Dunfermline Abbey in Scotland. Now we're going to get to the third part of the talk, and this will be fairly brief, but quite important. Margaret's sainthood and the restoration of the House of Wessex. Why is Margaret important to history, not just for her life or what happens after? Well, ultimately it's her children, and in particular her daughter, that is why Margaret is so important to the history of the British Isles. Now, Margaret, like I said, has many children, and one of these is Edith, also known as Matilda. Now, after William the Conqueror dies, as I said, William Rufus becomes William II. And after William's brother Henry becomes Henry I of England, and he has married um, Matilda at Edgar's encouragement. And this political act, this marriage between Matilda and Henry, the daughter of Margaret, restores the line of Wessex to the English throne and thereafter. So we have that brief period with William and William II where there is no Wessex blood in the English throne. There is no English blood on the English lineage, but this is restored through the marriage of Henry and Matilda. And then we have also another important figure, one of Margaret's sons with Malcolm, King David. Now, King David has to wait to become king. He doesn't become king after his father Malcolm dies in 1093. That's for his brother Edgar and also Alexander to become kings. But after that, David does become king, and he instigates lots of religious reforms in the style of his mother, and he's crucially king during the anarchy, where Matilda and Henry's daughter, so Margaret's granddaughter, also known as Matilda, Empress Matilda, is supposed to be the monarch after Henry dies because they don't have a son. However, Stephen of Blois becomes monarch, and there is this civil war almost known as the anarchy in the 1100s. And King David obviously supports his niece, Matilda, as the rightful heir to the English throne. However, through political expediency, sometimes he has to acknowledge Stephen when Stephen's in the ascendancy. But during this period where this anarchy, this civil war is happening in the southern parts of the British Isles, David takes this as an opportunity to enlarge his territory further south into England. And Scotland is a comparative peaceful haven in comparison to England at the time. Now, Margaret is canonized, which means made a saint, in 1205 by Pope Innocent IV, and she is therefore known as Saint Margaret of Scotland. But let's fast forward 400 years, where James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, and I think this is one of the most interesting ways Margaret has been remembered. So if we cast our mind back to that Tudor period, we have Henry VIII, then we have his son Edward, then we have his daughter Mary, and then Elizabeth has that long reign. When Elizabeth dies without an heir to the throne, James VI of Scotland takes the throne of England. And in this watershed moment, there is a Scottish monarch on the throne of England. Now, James has to legitimize his reign amongst the nobility and as a general English populace, and he does this in two ways. Firstly, he emphasizes his lineage through all the way back to Margaret of Wessex, through Matilda. So he emphasizes that he is descended rightfully through his ancestor Margaret Tudor, which then links him to the English line all the way back to Matilda and Henry, and therefore Margaret of Wessex as well. However, other English monarchs can also claim that as well. So what he does, he also claims that he has a more significant claim, a more important and righteous claim to the English throne than any other monarch in English history since that time, because he says he has a superior claim to even Elizabeth and Henry, because he can also claim his descendants to the male son of Margaret, David. So he has a two-pronged lineage to the English throne. He is heir to the English throne through Matilda, but also through David. And he says, because of the law of primogeniture, he says that claim is superior because no other English monarch has been able to claim that. But him being a Scottish monarch descended from David as well, King David I of Scotland, means that he has an even more, and in that way, back to Margaret, gives him that rightful claim to the English throne. And I think that's really significant that in the beginning of the 1600s, 500 years removed from this time period, a king of England and a king of Scotland are claiming their legitimacy to the English throne because of Margaret of Wessex, through Margaret of Wessex. And I think that is quite incredible. And her feast day has largely been remembered on November the 16th today. And my last point in this talk is just to consider Margaret. Could she be considered as a patron saint? Now, as you've noticed from my accent, I'm not Scottish. So I want to remain humble and not to presume too much, because like I said, I'm not an expert on this time period per se, and I'm certainly don't claim to be an expert on Scottish history. However, when I've been thinking about the concept of patron saints, you can also think, do patron saints have a role in British society today anyway? Because we are an increasingly secular society, and obviously patron saints have that link to Christianity. And a lot of them are saints because of what they have done for the Christian faith. However, if we just cast that aside and assume that we will have patron saints, and if we look at the patron saints of the British Isles, we have two patron saints that are native to their country, Patrick in Ireland and David in Wales, both native to those countries. But in England and Scotland, we have two non-native saints. We have St. George in England, who was born in modern-day Turkey, and we have St. Andrew in Scotland, who was born in modern-day Israel, Palestine. So we have two non-native saints, and they're important to our flags, obviously. But I'd just like you to consider, and this is something that you might want to jump in on the live chat and ask me about, or just consider, is could Margaret be a more worthy saint of Scotland? Obviously, she wasn't a native Scot, born in Hungary, raised in England, but she did play for the majority of her life, lived in Scotland, was Queen of Scotland, and had a lot of influence on Scotland. And would she be a more worthy saint than Andrew, for example, because she has that Scottish link that Andrew does not during his lifetime? And this is a theme that I will return to for England, for example, in my next talk, which will be in June, about St. Alban. Could he be classed as maybe the patron saint of England? And that's been suggested by others in the past. And then I think I'll be giving a talk this time next year about St. Edmund, Edmund the Martyr, who could also be considered maybe as an English patron saint and was in large parts of English history. But something just to leave you with there. So that's me done. I would just like to urge you to like and subscribe to this video if you enjoyed this talk. That really helps us out at History Indoors and helps the video gain traction after this talk. I'd like to draw your attention also to two future talks that we've got there. One by Michael that he might want to talk a little bit about in a moment, in 2 weeks' time, about the Anglo-Dutch Wars. And then in mid-December, we've got Mike O'Keefe with his second part of his talk about code breaking and warfare. You can sign up to those talks by scanning the QR code. And in the meantime, please do leave questions and comments in the chat box, because we will enter a time of Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen, for that. And well, I learned so much. Like, it's not something I know much about, especially early medieval history. Something that I don't know much at all about. So thank you, Stephen, for that great talk. And people are coming with comments. So thank you, very interesting. And thank you for commenting. Thank you for liking our talks and for being part of all this. So thank you to those watching as well. We'd love to have you around and with us. Please do ask questions. I think there's some interesting things coming in, so please do ask some questions. My first question, Stephen, is because I've got the microphone, guys, so I get the first question because that's the power of the host, and something that I've used a lot over the years. For example, after my talk now about Robert Blake, the general at sea, probably England's greatest admiral. That is in 2 weeks' time. Please do sign up for that, because why not? It's me talking, and it'll be really interesting. Just playing my own trumpet there. It's really interesting. Robert Blake, a 17th century admiral. But going back to the talk at hand, Stephen, Margaret, the question is for me is that what is her legacy today? I don't know much about her. I don't know if maybe people in England would know much about her. Maybe people in Scotland know much about her really. I mean, do we find that her legacy's just declined over years as our people have become more prominent? What is her legacy today in Scotland and in England, in both ways, really?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think, well, I firstly like to encourage anybody watching with their own thoughts on this, especially anybody watching from Scotland, to put in the box. So, I've only been to Scotland twice in my lifetime. I haven't been to Dunfermline Abbey. I haven't even been to Edinburgh. So those are two places on my wish list that are very high up to go to. So I know there are some street names named after Margaret, for example. But in terms of how she's been remembered, I think her epithets are really important. So being Queen Saint Margaret of Scotland is one. That's quite an important epithet for her to have. So her name as one, not just being Saint Margaret or Saint Margaret due to and Saint Margaret the Pious or anything like that. She is Saint Margaret of Scotland, so she's ascribed to the country of Scotland in that way. So I think that is really important and interesting in and of itself. And then also her other epithet, Margaret of Wessex, and that's an important epithet to cast our mind back to that line of Wessex, in a way that maybe Edgar isn't even. Edgar Ætheling, he's known as Edgar Ætheling, with an Ætheling meaning sort of the prince, the next in line to the throne, but he's not really even remembered as Edgar of Wessex. So Wessex conjures a lot of thoughts in our heads of that line, and I think people will probably instantly, if they know things about the period, will instantly think of Alfred. When we think of Wessex, we think of Alfred, and Alfred being Alfred the Great, and if people do remember Alfred, and I don't think he's remembered enough, in my opinion. I think my own personal opinion is that we start history too late in this country. We focus on 1066 and not much before, but that's a question for another time. But so I think even in her names, her epithets, that's really important how she is remembered. And I found it really interesting how monarchs have employed, like James I has employed her memory to back up his claim to the English throne in a really interesting genetic way. I think that's really interesting. Today, I must say, I will have to pass that over to anybody in Scotland that's watching. And obviously, if you're watching this back at a later date, please put it in the comment box in the YouTube as well, because I genuinely like to know how well she's been remembered in Scotland. But this is why I'm saying I'd like to get thoughts as well on whether people from Scotland are quite happy with St Andrew being their patron saint, or whether they would maybe like a native saint, in which case Margaret, not being fully native but definitely being more aligned with Scotland, would fit that bill. I can only speak from an Englishman that I would much rather see St Alban or St Edmund as our patron saint, as Edmund once was in the medieval period, rather than George. But that's just my own personal opinion.
Well, yeah, I do agree with you. I mean, there's reasons why George is chosen as a saint, but that's another topic for another day. You can probably cover that next talk. But it would just to see if like a film about Margaret. Have a film, like a real Hollywood kind of style film on it, because I think there's a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss, and a lot to think about in her life. I mean, very interesting, and as you described, a very important figure in the history of the entire of the Isles, from England and in Scotland. So it'd be really interesting to see if they could do something so much with this, couldn't they?
Oh gosh, they could do so much with 1066. I think for all it's well remembered in terms of the history books, and it's one of the few dates in English history that people will say, oh yeah, the Battle of Hastings, rather than I imagine, Michael, if you named one of the dates from the 1600s for the Civil War, not if you said, let's say 1643 or something, for one of the battles, people wouldn't automatically say the Battle of, what's that, Naseby, Newbury?
What that again?
1643.
1643. It's not Naseby. It's not. It's Newbury, probably.
Newbury, that's one. So people wouldn't automatically say that, and not even maybe Edge Hill. Whereas when you say 1066, you think Battle of Hastings straight away. So, but in terms of thinking about the story, the four claimants to the throne, the Battle of Stamford Bridge that happens before it. I mean, man alive, you could have so many great films about it, but I feel it's really been neglected in TV and film. And likewise in Margaret's life, you could have so much.
I mean, just before jumping again, is that people, if you do have questions, please do put them in the comments, because I'm happy to show them. We'll definitely talk about them if you do have any questions, because we'd love to hear from you, the audience, as well. But just to add on to that, do you think that there's a reason, thinking about why there's been a decline in her maybe legacy and memory? I mean, you said James I uses James I of England, James VI of Scotland uses her very, very heavily. Do you think there's a reason why there's a decline? Maybe it's the decline of sainthood, maybe perhaps in England and Scotland in the 17th century as well, and 18th century. Maybe that's the reason why there's the decline as well. Because I thought, when you look at the 19th century and the idea of Britishness, linking the two, Scotland and England, together, Margaret would have been a fantastic character to use, wouldn't she? When you're thinking about an identity, Margaret would be a fantastic one for that British unity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're on something there. I'm teaching the Civil War at the moment, and the 1600s, and seeing sort of the decline of the Catholic Church, and not just the Protestant Church rising, but that form of Protestantism, Puritanism, and that moving away from that that evangelical Protestantism, where there's a move away from recognizing saints and having that strict liturgical calendar. And I wonder whether, even though the Church of England throughout history still has their church calendar and adheres to that, maybe in a similar fashion to Catholicism, but I wonder if that sort of just overall decline of maybe the importance of saints, maybe the saturation of saints as well. So it's something that I'll cover in my talk about St. Alban, and I think one of our watchers talked about what the definition of saint is, and about saint being a helper. Well, when I talk about St. Alban next year, I'll actually kind of cover a more formal definition of sainthood, and I'll argue that actually it was a very broad definition. It didn't even have to be a miracle, and in many ways, the categories for sainthood, if we had the same categories today, somebody like Elizabeth II would be classed as a saint. Some of our most popular figures in history, but that's another talk. So I think that I was trying to nail down a figure of how many saints there are, and I don't think it's even possible. I think there are so many saints in so many different countries that have been recognized that it's very, very hard to pin down a definitive list of saints. So maybe the saturation of saints, even though there's so many, there's you'd think that might lead to more memory, but maybe that's a dilution of memory. I think also just, and I argue about this a lot, in my talks about this time period, the general amnesia of the pre-conquest period, if it's not strictly to do with the four claimants to the throne and William the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings itself, then there's a general amnesia. I talk to my students a lot, and a lot of them assume that William the Conqueror is the first king of England, and I say no, the first king of all England is generally recognised as King Athelstan. But that's a name that's not a household name. Most people would say William if they were going to take an educated guess. So I wonder if it's just part of this, we don't learn much about pre-conquest history in school, and therefore that seeps into Hollywood. I don't know, but I don't even know why the Battle of Hastings isn't. And then, but I can't talk for Scotland. Maybe Malcolm, the real Malcolm Canmore, not the Malcolm of Macbeth, even though like I said, I'm not as disparaging of Shakespeare as many other people would be. And I might even talk about Shakespeare as a historian maybe in a year or so's time. That's what I'm sort of leading up to, but I'm not quite there yet. But yeah, maybe, I don't know if in Scottish history classes Malcolm, for example, is remembered better, and therefore Margaret.
We should ask Ryan, because Ryan's now one of our old historians who's he's moved up to Scotland, and he teaches now in Scotland. So maybe we should ask him, because he knows the history curriculum there. So maybe we should ask him and see what he says.
I'll ask you about that after the talk, Michael. I didn't know.
And I think there's room for me and you, Stephen, to talk about forgotten history at some point as well, because I think it is certainly interesting. Why is this period forgotten? Why is it not remembered, or why is it not taught as much? As saying something there to think about and digest as well, because there's certainly something to talk about. I just had some other things to think about as well. People don't be asking many questions. So again, if you do have a question, you can please do ask it. We won't bite. We promise. I think we're quite friendly. I think, Stephen. I think we are.
I like to think so.
Well, one thing as well is kind of like legacy, because we know in the medieval period, obviously Scotland remains quite, especially Catholic, going on even into the Reformation period for quite a strong while, but especially by Prince Charlie and the like. There's elements still there. And again, I wonder if like the legacy of Margaret would have an impact that. Now that's not a really question. That's more of a kind of a thought process. If Margaret's kind of legacy there would have helped and stirred up the kind of the emotions and the kind of pride in that by Prince Charlie time period of the 18th century. Something to think about as well. And
yeah. I also, and this might be one for you, Michael, they said that Catholic heritage, but also that Protestantism, because kind of teaching about King Charles I, and there's that rebellion in Scotland about the prayer book, and Presbyterianism has a strong heritage in Scotland, doesn't it? So yeah, there is that sort of parallel history of Scotland, religion in Scotland that's running through that is really interesting. But perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that than I.
Perhaps one day. I definitely, something to think about. I mean, certainly. I mean, when Charlie, he's certainly coming with a Catholic mindset, and certainly some of the clans still have a Catholic allegiance. And I wonder if that also comes from the legacy of Margaret's reforms and her changes to the church as well, which also have a very deep impact in Scotland throughout the next, centuries, don't they? Because it's not only her, but her children. And I wonder if that impacts the clans as well, and impacts how the clans, not all the clans, depending on where the clan was and alike, but some of the clans' legacy as well. If they still had that kind of mindset from not just from maybe Margaret, but also her children as well.
Yeah, and her religious changes and her children after try and align Scotland with more of the Christianity that's happening on the continent. Trying to align, and there's if you read the work by Bede, the Venerable Bede, a lot, his whole tracts are about, these seem like quite minute, we Christians today would call them maybe secondary issues about, when dates of things should be celebrated. And, there'd be many Christian groups that wouldn't even care about that. But there is this real push to align the church. There's either the Celtic influence or the influence from the Roman Christian church. And I believe that Margaret, when she takes the throne, when she's Queen of Scotland with Malcolm, that she's trying to align Scotland's religious practices to those of the continent to make it more uniform. Thinking of other religious saints Scotland could have, Columba's definitely up there as well. I mean, he's Irish by birth, I think, but he spends a lot of his time in what is present day Scotland, introducing Christianity there. So just thinking about other, even if you didn't take Margaret, there's also Columba there that could also be class of the patron saint. So the thing is, I don't know how loved Andrew is as a saint in Scotland, and so I wouldn't want to take assume that Scotland, if you want to take that away, I can only think with George in England, there's not really much love for George. We maybe during football we do, but there's not this national warmth towards him. So I just wonder if it's the same as Scotland or not.
Do you know what? There's another talk idea, Stephen, St George, because I know quite a bit about St George's legacy. So maybe we could do something there at some point as well.
This is leading towards, we're sort of moving out of the early medieval women series and into sort of the saints of the British Isles series. So maybe that could be, you could join me on that series.
A nice merger, I like that. It's very, very well done.
This is the crossover.
Could I just make a comment as well, just on the talk you gave, Stephen, as well, is that you saw Margaret's children. Yes, you got the English influence with the names of her brothers and fathers and grandfathers as well, but also you got the religious influence there as well. David, Mary, I noticed. So you're seeing, aren't you, both of the, we'd be arguing through that whole talk. You see it in her children's names. Her religious influence, the English influence, the religious influence in her life. You see it in their children's names. I think that is just it's a really great way of just kind of looking at her impact and who she was as well. So I think is really, really good.
100%.
Well, we'll bring this to a close because no one's asking many questions, so we can bring this to a close. But thank you everyone who's been here. It's great to have so many of you with us this evening to share in this kind of talk, in our discussion. We hope you find it interesting. We hope that you've kind of gained something from this. Please do contact us if you have any questions as well. We're more like happy to answer anything they send our way through our website or through our email. But again, until next time, with Robert Blake and myself, thank you again for being here. Please do subscribe to the channel. Please do like this YouTube video, and we will see you very, very soon. So once more again, thank you, Stephen, for your great talk. Loved every minute of it, and thank you all for being here. So it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from Stephen, which is almost creating a 2-1. So
Thanks, everybody.
bye, everyone.